2 of the Video Guide to British Birds. This new edition includes more moving footage than ever before and a brand new commentary written specially to fit the pictures and sound recordings. The net result is a complete guide to bird identification, explained in a way impossible with any other medium. This tape covers British species in systematic order, starting with raptors and ending with waders. It therefore includes the magnificent raptors or birds of prey, with spectacular displays and hunting techniques. The fat-bodied, small-headed game birds. The secretive rails and crakes. And the bewildering assortment of birds known as waders or shorebirds, which occur in vast numbers around our coasts and make such wonderful noises on their breeding grounds. For a detailed list of contents, please refer to the card that comes with each tape. Notice that each species is given a reference number, corresponding to the one shown here. This number tells you the overall length of the bird in centimetres, from the tip of its bill to the end of its tail. The names shown on the screen are those recommended for international use by the British Ornithologists' Union. In the commentary, however, I've continued to use the traditional names, more familiar to most British birdwatchers. The clear and detailed illustrations by Alan Harris show the different plumages of each species at rest and in flight. The commentary concentrates on how to identify each species in the field, pointing out features which can be seen and heard as you view the footage of each bird. In trying to describe the rich variety of bird calls and song, I've often resorted to making my own imitations of these sounds. These are usually hopelessly unlike the real thing, but I hope you'll still find them useful. Think of them as translations of natural bird sounds into noises which any human, even me, can imitate and remember. The distribution of each species is shown by on-screen maps. Green shows areas where the species is present throughout the year, yellow shows where it is only found in summer, and blue shows the areas visited in winter. The distribution of very rare visitors is shown in grey. Now, let's begin this volume with honey buzzard. Who would imagine that a bird as big as a honey buzzard, with a hooked beak and talons, should feed by grubbing on the ground for the larvae of bees and wasps? In fact, this species is not really a buzzard at all, although it does superficially resemble one. It is best distinguished by rather subtle differences in shape. The head is longer and narrower, the tail longer and slimmer, and the wings longer and held horizontally during soaring flight. Plumages of both buzzards are confusingly variable, but honey buzzards are sometimes characteristically barred across the underwings. And if you can see that the tail has only 3 well-spaced dark bars, then you can be sure that you've got a honey buzzard. The mewing call, somewhat weaker, more pathetic than a buzzard's, is only heard in a few parts of Britain, since this is an exceptionally scarce summer visitor, with probably less than 20 pairs in the whole country. There are a few places where you can observe their spectacular wing-clapping displays. Great Holden Forest in Devon is perhaps the best known. Red kite. With its richly coloured plumage, dramatic outline, effortlessly graceful flight and spine-tingling call, the red kite is perhaps our most glamorous bird of prey. Even in silhouette, the kite is unmistakable, with long, relatively pointed wings angled to create an M shape, and a long, deeply forked tail with pointed corners. At closer range you can enjoy the rich red of its underparts, and especially the almost orange colour of its upper tail, tipped with black corners. The red kite's wailing call is so evocative of Welsh hillsides in spring. The British kite population almost became extinct, but it has now recovered enough to reach about 100 pairs. Virtually all of these are in Wales, which is where you must go to see them, unless you chance upon one of the birds which have been reintroduced elsewhere in Britain. Marsh harrier. The sight of a marsh harrier drifting over a reed bed, slowly and watchfully on V-shaped wings, is thankfully becoming a more frequent event in Britain. It is larger than other harriers, with broader wings, a shorter tail, and showing no signs of a pale rump. Juvenile marsh harriers can appear completely dark brown, but they usually show some pale plumage on the head, giving them the nickname of cream crowns. In females, this pale pattern becomes more extensive with age, spreading across the leading edge of the wing. As male marsh harriers get older, they acquire areas of grey, until their plumage becomes a patchwork of brown in the body, grey in the wings and tail, and black at the wingtips. They produce a variety of calls, the most familiar of which is the squealing begging call of females or young. As recently as 1971, the British population of marsh harriers was down to just one pair at Minsmere, Suffolk, but numbers have now recovered to almost 100 pairs. These are found mostly around the marshes of East Anglia, with scattered pairs at reed beds elsewhere. Hen harrier. The spectacular tumbling, somersaulting, skydiving displays of a male hen harrier deserve to be accompanied by drum rolls, cymbal crashes, and thunderous applause at the sheer breathtaking, daredevil effort of it all. Hen harriers may glide slowly over the ground on V-shaped wings like marsh harriers, but they are always smaller and slimmer. A male, like this one, lacks the brown body of a marsh harrier, and so is almost completely grey, or even white, apart from the black wingtips and the smoky trailing edge to the wing. Females or immatures are noticeably longer in the wing than marsh harriers and have obvious white rumps. Their barred tails earn them the nickname of ringtails. Hen harriers' chattering calls are rarely heard away from their breeding grounds. Hen harriers are the most numerous British harriers, with over 500 breeding pairs. These are found almost entirely on high moorland areas in Wales, the Pennines, and especially in Scotland. In winter, however, many birds occur further south, often favouring coastal marshes and estuaries. Montagu's harrier. Sadly, the Montagu's harrier is probably Britain's rarest breeding raptor, with less than 10 pairs present in Britain in most years. Its plumages are very similar to those of the hen harrier, but this is an even slimmer and skinnier looking bird, with the wingtips looking particularly narrow, even falcon-like. Other features include the more obvious dark and light face pattern of a female Montes, and the rich ginger, almost orange underparts of the immatures. Adult male Montagues have a darker, vaguely streaked belly, and their wings have obvious horizontal bars on both upper and undersides, making the whole bird look patchier than the clean male hen harrier. Their chattering calls are unlikely to be heard by most birders in Britain. It is difficult to explain why the Montagu's harrier is so rare, when they have in the past bred in so many habitats in England and Wales, including heathland, moorland, marshland and cereal fields. The few remaining pairs seem to be confined to East Anglia and central southern England. Sparrowhawk. The sparrowhawk population was badly hit during the post-war boom in pesticide usage, but once these chemicals were removed, the population recovered with a vengeance, making it commoner than the kestrel in some areas. The sparrowhawk is about the same size as a kestrel, and has a similarly long tail, but its wings have rounded, not pointed tips, and are shorter, as if not fully extended. Whether soaring or gliding, sparrowhawks have a characteristic flap-flap glide action, seen here in slow motion. Adults near the nest make various kecking noises, like goshawks but weaker and less menacing. In late summer, the young birds squeal for food. Sparrowhawks are now found throughout Britain except on the highest ground. They prefer woodland areas, but are increasingly nesting in towns and taking small birds from gardens. The distinctive alarm call of a blue tit is an excellent clue to the presence of a sparrowhawk, so look up whenever you hear this. Goshawk. The goshawk is now well established as a British breeding bird, thanks largely to both deliberate and accidental release of falconers' birds. Wherever they've come from, birdwatchers can be grateful for the chance to watch their springtime display flights, strutting over the woods with slow, stiff wing beats, or doing the bumps as if on an aerial roller coaster. The goshawk is best described as a great big sparrowhawk, although some male goshawks may be only slightly bigger than their relative. Such birds have to be identified with care. Their relatively longer wings seem to be more stretched out, and their tail is relatively shorter, broader, and more rounded at the tip. The typical flap-flap-flap glide is smoother and more effortless than in a sparrowhawk. Their penetrating kek-kek-kek calls from the heart of a wood can still raise the hairs on the back of my neck. There may now be over 200 pairs of goshawks in Britain, most of which are in Wales. It's no good looking for them in the dense mature forests in which they breed. Find a vantage point overlooking the woods and wait for them to soar and perform. Buzzard. Wherever you drive in the north and west of Britain, you are always likely to see a buzzard, either soaring above a woodland or sitting watchfully on a roadside pole. Buzzards are sizable and chunky birds, with large, broad, blunt-ended wings, fairly short, broad tails, and short, rounded heads. They can show a variety of plumages, but they are generally dull brown, with darker areas at the wrists and paler panels in the primaries. Notice how the wings are swept upwards and forwards when they soar. Their mewing calls evoke for me memories of walks in the Welsh valleys, though you may associate them with other parts of Britain. The 15,000 or so pairs of buzzards are spread throughout Scotland, Wales, southwest England and the Lake District, but they are scarce in the rest of England, perhaps due to illegal persecution by gamekeepers. Rough-legged buzzard. The rough-legged buzzard is a very scarce visitor to Britain, so birdwatchers get understandably excited when, in certain years, several of these birds arrive and stay with us throughout the winter. They are slightly bigger than common buzzards, with longer, floppier wings and usually paler underparts. They also show a greater tendency to hover, which they do with surprising ease. Their most convincing feature, however, is their obvious white tail, with a broad dark band at its tip. Their mewing calls are more drawn out than those of common buzzards. Most sightings of rough-legged buzzards are on the east coast, but apart from East Anglia, other favoured wintering sites have included the North Yorkshire Moors and the South Pennines. Golden eagle. Lots of visitors to the Highlands of Scotland are convinced they've seen a golden eagle, but often they've just been over-impressed by a soaring buzzard. The massive size of a golden eagle may not be obvious from a distance, so you have to notice differences in shape. The eagle is relatively long-headed and long-tailed, and, above all, its wings are exceptionally long and relatively straight-edged with deeply fingered tips. The impression is of long, narrow planks held up in a shallow V. The golden nape is about the only noteworthy plumage feature on an adult eagle, but the immatures have striking white markings in their wings and tails. About 400 pairs of golden eagles breed in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, plus a few others in southwest Scotland, and just one pair in the Lake District. Osprey. Imagine the excitement among Scottish birdwatchers when the first ospreys returned to breed in the 1950s. Some of that excitement has since been shared by over 1.5 million people who have now visited the famous Loch Garten Eyrie. Ospreys are very distinctive birds. Their mostly white underparts with black wrist patches rule out most other birds except perhaps an exceptionally pale buzzard species. Ospreys, however, have a unique shape, with their long narrow wings always kinked at the wrist to make an M shape and always arched when seen head-on. Their habits of hovering over water, then plunging feet first to catch a fish, are of course unique amongst raptors. Notice how this bird shakes itself when rising from the water, another characteristic habit. Their shrill whistling calls are mostly produced at the nest, especially when an intruding osprey flies by. The Scottish osprey population has increased impressively since those first birds returned, and almost 100 pairs now breed. This has led to more sightings in England, as these birds migrate to and from their African wintering grounds. Some ospreys already spend the whole summer in England, where nesting must surely take place soon. Kestrel. The silhouette of a hovering kestrel is a familiar and welcome sight in the British countryside, especially by roadsides where the unkempt grassy verges harbour plenty of potential prey. This hovering habit is the easiest way to identify a kestrel, since it is the only small British bird of prey which does so. Its long pointed wings indicate that this is a falcon, not a hawk, and no other British falcon has such a long tail. The brown on the back is much warmer, redder in tone than any other small bird of prey, and this usually contrasts well with the virtually black outer wing. Their shrill calls, sounding tremulous and panic-stricken, are mostly heard around the nest site. Kestrels are almost ubiquitous in Britain, nesting in a great variety of habitats, from remote moorland crags to busy urban office blocks. Merlin. The merlin is our smallest falcon, but it's arguably the most aggressive, fearlessly attacking larger birds or even humans which venture near its nest, and relentlessly pursuing its victims with dashing aerobatic skills. The merlin has the pointed wings of a kestrel, but is smaller and shorter-tailed, with darker, duller plumage. It flies with great speed and agility, using quick, shallow wing beats to pursue small birds. At close range, its moustache is less obvious than on any other British falcon. Adult males are slaty blue above, with a black tip to the tail. Females and immatures are a dull dark brown above, heavily streaked below. Their shrill, chattering calls are quite similar to those of the kestrel. About 700 pairs of merlins breed in moorland areas in northern England, Scotland, Wales and parts of Ireland, but these are mostly in remote places where they are rarely seen. In winter, though, they occur more widely and are particularly fond of estuaries and salt marshes. Hobby. Whether it's causing havoc amongst roosting swallows or delicately snatching dragonflies around the edge of a lake, the hobby is always a delightful bird to see. It's about the size of a kestrel, but it has the dark upper parts and facial mask of a peregrine. It is best identified by its unusually long, rather loose wings and characteristic whippy flight. This bird not only shows the distinctive red trousers of an adult hobby, but also a characteristic way of feeding, catching insects with the feet and transferring them to the mouth in mid-air. The chattering calls are typical of a small falcon. Hobbies are summer visitors, present from late April to early October, and breeding mostly on heaths or other areas with scattered trees. They especially like wetland areas, which attract both hirundines and insects. Until recently they were confined to southern England, but they are now spreading northwards, as their population has surged from less than 100 pairs in 1974 to over 500 pairs in the early 1990s. Peregrine falcon. Peregrine falcons feed on birds such as pigeons by stooping down on them from a great height and knocking them out of the sky in an explosion of feathers. It has been claimed that peregrines reach 180 miles an hour during a stoop, which would make it the fastest living thing on Earth. They are bigger and more powerful than the other British falcons, with the larger females looking impressively deep-chested. They generally look dark above and pale below, and fly with quick, shallow wing beats. The thick black moustachial lobes aren't easy to see, but the upper chest often looks distinctively white from a distance. The long pointed wings and short, broad, tapering tail produce a characteristic anchor shape. Their calls are much deeper than those of other British falcons, and they tend to echo menacingly around the rocky cliffs and quarries on which these birds breed. The use of pesticides caused a crash in the British peregrine population in the 60s. Since then, the significant chemicals have been banned, and the peregrines have undergone super recovery to about 1,500 pairs just 30 years later. That's more than ever before. They are now present in all upland areas of Britain and on many sea cliffs too, and can be observed from a number of public watch points, including Simon's Yat near Monmouth and Rishforth Quarries off the M62 in West Yorkshire. Red grouse. Apart from the unconvincing Scottish crossbill, the red grouse is the nearest thing we've got to a truly British bird. It is said to be just a subspecies of the continental willow grouse, but has a completely different plumage and occurs only in Britain. The grouse is bigger than any partridge, with a much darker, richer red-brown plumage, especially in the males. They fly with fast whirring wings, then long glides, with the wings held stiffly bowed and often with the head held up. The corners of the tail are black, not rufous as in partridges. Their characteristic gabak gabak calls, so evocative of British heathermoors, are elaborated during their displays into something more like back 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 gabak 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 gabak. Red grouse are found in almost all areas of heather moorland in Scotland, Wales and northern England, but they are now scarce on Dartmoor and Exmoor. Their numbers are greatest where the moorland habitat is managed to their benefit by gamekeepers. Ptarmigan. The ptarmigan must be just about the hardiest bird in the world. Their high mountain environment can be bitterly bleak even in spring, but these birds remain on high ground throughout the winter days and nights. Their plumages change to match the conditions in each season. In winter they are snowy white, apart from black in the tail, a black eye and a black bill. The male also has red wattles above the eyes and black lores between the eye and the bill. As spring proceeds, the birds acquire grey feathers, making them a mottled patchwork of grey and white. By high summer, they look mostly granite grey, apart from a white belly and, in flight, white wings. Their superb camouflage makes it especially important to learn their calls, especially the creaking rattle like a wooden spoon dragging slowly over a cheese grater. Ptarmigan are found mostly on the very tops of the mountains, especially amongst jumbles of large rocks, although in winter they may retreat into lower gullies. Such suitable habitat is only found in Britain in the Scottish Highlands. Black grouse. Displaying black grouse are a joy to behold. Groups of male birds gather at dawn in certain open areas which become display arenas called leks. Each male competes with others by calling, posturing, chasing and even grappling in an attempt to occupy the central part of the lek. Males which win this contest are the ones chosen for copulation by females, which arrive at the lek when they are fertile. Who could forget the thrust and parry of the jousting males, with wings down and undertail coverts erect, gleaming white in the dim light? Male black grouse could only be confused with capercaillies, but they are smaller, with forked tails and white wing bars. Females are more like red grouse, but are bigger, greyer and have narrow white wing bars. The lekking performance is accompanied by a chorus of wonderful sounds, a bubbling rucku rucku, and a hissing sound like the closing of hydraulic doors. In Britain, the black grouse is declining, but can still be found in much of Scotland and parts of Wales and the Pennines. They inhabit areas around the edges of woodlands, including conifer plantations, but feeding especially on birch buds. They are less likely to be found on open heather moorland unless birch trees are nearby. Capercaillie. I just had to see one of these birds from the moment I read that flushing a capercaillie is like treading on a bomb. And once I'd heard a recording of their extraordinary territorial calls, I just knew I had to see one displaying. The male is the largest grouse in the world, almost entirely blue-black in plumage. In spring, he displays by dropping his wings, fanning his black tail like a peacock, and strutting around with his head pointing skywards. Theoretically, the males should gather at communal leks, like black grouse, but in Britain you would be fortunate indeed to find just one displaying male, let alone several together. The female capper most closely resembles the female black grouse, but she is bigger and warmer brown, with distinct rufous colouring in her throat, breast and tail. The remarkable display calls consist of repeated scraping noises, then accelerating knocking sounds like a dropping ping-pong ball, all climaxed by the spectacular popping of a champagne cork. In Britain, the capercaillie is restricted to areas of mature woodland in the Scottish Highlands, especially the old Caledonian pine forests in Speyside and Deeside, where the undergrowth is deep and lush. Sadly, their range is rapidly constricting, and numbers have declined so much that this is now a difficult bird to enjoy. Red-legged partridge. The red-legged partridge is not a native British bird, having established itself here thanks to many introduction schemes from the 18th century onwards. It is a gaudier bird than the grey partridge, with a strikingly black and white face and throat, and pronounced black and white barring on its flanks. In flight, though, it is actually plainer, with unmottled grey-brown upper parts. In some parts of Britain, the closely related chucker partridge has been introduced, with limited success, although many hybrids now occur in the wild. Pure redlegs, though, can be told by the extensive black speckled gorget around their breasts. Their calls include the distinctive chuk-chuk-chuk-caw, chuk-caw sounds. The red-legged partridge is abundant on the lowland farms of eastern England, but gets progressively scarcer further west. It is absent from most of Wales, southwest England, and most areas north and west of the Pennines. Grey partridge. The grey partridge was formerly the commonest bird on many lowland farms, but it has declined so alarmingly in the last 40 years that it could be on the way to becoming a national rarity. It has a mottled plumage of grey and brown, highlighted by a red face and throat, and a horseshoe-shaped black belly patch, most obvious on the males. In flight, their upper parts are browner and more mottled than in a redleg, and their flank markings are less bold. When flushed, grey partridges make a soft pittering sound. Their display calls, given most often at dusk and dawn, include the characteristic rasping kierek, kierek. Although they are much less numerous than before, partridges are still widespread through most of Britain, except northwest Scotland. However, they are fast disappearing from Ireland, Wales and southwest England. They have always been associated with farmland, especially at low altitudes, but they now seem to be surviving best in higher areas such as the edges of moors. Quail. Even if the quail was not so scarce, it would still be one of the most difficult species to see, since it hardly ever leaves the cover of tall, dense foliage. Only its unforgettable call gives away its presence. The quail is a tiny game bird, most likely to be mistaken for a half-grown young partridge, but the male has a black and white head pattern, which is mimicked in a duller brown version by the female. If you are lucky enough to flush one, you'll see a dumpy, hump-backed, narrow-winged game bird skimming low over the vegetation with quick, shallow wing beats. More likely, though, you'll have to be content with just hearing the male, calling with endless, monotonous and frustrating regularity, whit, 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 usually described as wet my lips. Quails are summer visitors to Britain, but usually arrive here in only limited numbers. In a good year, however, many more are heard. 1989 was exceptional, with an estimated 2,600 calling males throughout the country. Pheasant. The gaudy cock pheasant is such a familiar part of the British country scene that it seems strange to imagine that it might not be here at all if it hadn't been artificially introduced many centuries ago. The male, of course, is unmistakable, with his reddish plumage, glossy green head and extravagantly long tail. The female is less striking due to her need for better camouflage, but her long spiky tail separates her from all other game birds. Pheasants aren't difficult to spot, but they are even easier to hear, especially the crowing caw-caw of the males. Pheasants have successfully established themselves in all parts of Britain, apart from central London and some of the Scottish and Welsh Highlands. They prefer areas of woodland and scrub with dense undergrowth, but often feed in nearby open areas. Water rail. The water rail is an elusive bird, thanks to the impenetrability of its marshland habitats and its secretive, often crepuscular habits, but thankfully its calls give it away. The long legs and feet, short upright tail and pot-bellied appearance identify this bird as a rail, and its long, pointed, usually red bill tells you immediately which species it is. You may see just the flicking off-white undertail feathers as it scoots back into the reeds, but a better view will reveal rich brown and black upper parts, heavily barred flanks and immaculate dunnet grey underparts. If flushed, water rails struggle low over the reeds with their long legs trailing behind. Their sharp ek calls are sometimes puzzling, but their loud squeals and grunts, like a pig being strangled, are familiar to many birdwatchers. Water rails are birds of reed beds and overgrown ponds, canals and ditches, but the loss of these habitats is making this species increasingly scarce. It is still found, however, at scattered wetlands throughout Britain, probably more widespread in winter than in summer. Spotted crake. Crakes are exciting creatures, secretive, mysterious and rare. They are most likely to be found at the umpteenth attempt by sitting quietly and optimistically at dusk beside a fly-infested reed bed in autumn. To find one in summer is an even greater thrill, but mercifully easier, thanks to its memorable, penetrating call. Spotted crakes are smaller and even more portly than water rails. The short bill confirms that this isn't a water rail, and the snowfall of white spots on the head, breast and upper parts proves that you have a spotted crake and not something even rarer. Their loud calls have been described as like a whiplash at close range, but like a dripping tap from a distance. Despite its ungainly shape, this is a long-distance migrant, flying from tropical Africa from late March and returning again during September to November. Most spotted crakes are located during these passage periods, but some overwinter in Britain and a few have been found breeding, especially in Scotland. Corncrake. The corncrake is a crake which has abandoned wetland habitats in favour of grassy meadows. In Britain at least, it may have made the wrong choice, since hay meadows now get churned up by mechanised harvesters before the corncrakes can rear their young safely. Consequently, the corncrake has gone from being a widespread farmland bird to one which is rare and seriously threatened. I needn't bother to describe a corncrake, since you stand virtually no chance of seeing one without indulging in practices which could disturb them. Even if you go to the right places, the best you can hope for is to hear their loud, grating calls. Crack, 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 crack. Exciting at first, but tedious after a while. The corncrake is a summer visitor, which has virtually disappeared from England, Wales and mainland Scotland in the last 50 years. Even in Ireland the population has shrunk dramatically, although some areas, here and in the Hebrides, still have healthy populations. But for how much longer? Moorhen. Moorhens are widespread and common, frequently seen jerking their heads to and fro like an Egyptian dancer, or flicking up their undertail feathers to make a white V sign to intruders. They are most similar to coots, but the fleshy shield on their forehead is red, not white, and they have obvious white markings under the tail and in a narrow line along the body. At closer range, the plumage is not completely black, but has shades of browns and greys. Their calls include a far-carrying prr, prr. Moorhens are found throughout Britain, except at high altitudes on almost any area of standing or at least slow-moving water, from tiny park ponds to huge lowland reservoirs. Coot. Many birdwatchers can't think of a bird more boring than the coot, as it is so often the bird they see lots of when they're looking for something rarer. In fact, coots are quite interesting. They are spectacularly aggressive, picking fights with just about every other coot, unless they notice that the white frontal shield facing them is fractionally bigger than their own. Such birds rule the roost on a coot pond. Coots are blissfully easy to identify, being entirely charcoal grey apart from the white bill and facial shield. The juvenile is browner, with a mostly white neck and face, but never has the white undertail of a moorhen. Coot chicks are engagingly ugly, like an old woman whose orange dye is causing her hair to fall out. With imagination, you can hear coots shouting their names. Coot, coot, coot. The coot isn't quite as widespread as the moorhen, tending to favour larger lakes rather than ponds, canals and rivers. However, Where it occurs, it is often much more numerous, especially in winter when huge rafts of these birds gather on certain lakes, reservoirs and gravel pits. Oystercatcher. Unlike most wading birds, the oystercatcher makes absolutely no effort to conceal itself. Not only is it brightly patterned, but also it draws attention to itself by calling noisily and even flying around any potential intruder. The bold black and white plumage of an oystercatcher is distinctive enough, even without the long bright red bill, which confirms its identity. In winter plumage, they have an extra white mark on the throat. The loud ringing calls are based on the single cleep, cleep, sometimes accelerating into frenzied piping trills. Especially in England, birdwatchers think of oystercatchers as coastal birds, breeding on shingle beaches and occurring in hundreds or even thousands on certain estuaries and mudflats. However, they also breed inland, on loch sides and exposed riverbeds in Scotland and northern England. This habit is now spreading to some areas south of the Humber. Avocet. The RSPB chose well when they adopted the avocet for their logo. Its elegance and beauty, based on neat black and white lines, make it an ideal subject for pen and ink artwork. It also symbolises a rare bird, which, with protection on RSPB reserves, has become successfully established in Britain. Avocets are easy to identify. No other British wader is mostly white, but marked with sparse, narrow black lines. And of course the upturned bill is a complete giveaway. If the bird is feeding, its bill may be hidden, but the way it is swept from side to side through the water is equally diagnostic. The calls of avocets are vaguely similar to those of oystercatchers, but are much more mellow. Cloot, cloot, cloot. Since the 1970s, avocets have spread successfully from 2 RSPB reserves in Suffolk, Minsmere and Havergate. They now breed at many sites between North Kent and Lincolnshire, usually favouring shallow coastal lagoons. Elsewhere in Britain, they are still very rare, except in southwest England, where some birds overwinter. Stone curlew. The idea that some dinosaurs didn't die out, they just evolved into birds, isn't difficult to imagine when you see a stone curlew. There's something about their strange shape, and especially the staring yellow eye, which seems decidedly prehistoric. It would be easy to identify them by their streaky brown plumage, long-bodied, long-tailed shape, and broad white bar across the folded wing. But always it is that eye which grabs your attention, flanked by a puffy white bag underneath and a bold white eyebrow above. In flight, stone curlews have a long brown body, but rather black and white looking wings, with 2 obvious white bars across the inner wing. Their wailing calls, given mostly at night, do indeed sound rather like a curlew, but one which is in pain. Other calls sound more like oystercatchers. Stone curlews are most unlikely to be found at the coast, except perhaps on a cliff-top down. Instead, they occur almost exclusively as rare summer visitors to the dry heaths of the Brecklands in East Anglia and around the Salisbury Plain. They can be easily seen using excellent viewing facilities at Weeting Heath in Norfolk. Little ringed plover. It's hard to imagine that 50 years ago the little ringed plover was rarer in Britain than the Kentish plover is today. Since the first pair bred in Hertfordshire in 1938, the LRP, as it is universally known, has become a familiar British bird. LRPs look superficially similar to ringed plovers, but they are smaller and have a distinctively furtive jizz, with crouching horizontal stance and a longer rear end, For confirmation, the adults have all dark bills, duller yellower legs, and a diagnostic yellow eye ring. Juveniles also have a yellow eye ring, but the all-brown hood, lacking obvious white areas, is a more obvious feature. In flight, the LRP is the only small plover which doesn't have an obvious wing bar. Its call is also distinctive, a shrill pew, 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 or, on breeding grounds, a reverberating preew, preew, preew. The little ring plover is a summer visitor, which now breeds at many scattered sites throughout England and Wales. The 800 plus pairs particularly favour gravel pits and other man-made sites such as quarries, slag heaps, industrial dumps, sewage farms and reservoirs. They also occur frequently at coastal localities, especially during migration times. Ringed plover. The ringed plover is another example of a bird which is normally associated with the coast and yet is now breeding inland with increasing frequency. Ringed plovers can be told from little ringed plovers by their larger size, pot-bellied appearance, bolder mannerisms and the lack of a yellow eye ring. Additionally, the adults have a thick black and yellow bill and brighter orange legs. Juveniles have a less uniform head pattern than a young LRP, including a broad pale mark behind the eye and a more obvious pale forehead. Ringed plovers show an obvious pale wing bar in flight, unlike little ringed plovers. Their call is distinctive, a soft poo-whip, poo-whip. Ringed plovers are resident all around the British coastline, wherever there are shingle beaches or relatively undisturbed sandy beaches. They are most numerous on the Scottish Islands. However, they also nest increasingly at inland sites, including gravel pits, lakes, reservoirs, riverbeds and industrial sites, especially in dry summers when low water levels expose extra feeding and nesting areas. Kentish plover. The Kentish plover no longer breeds in Kent, or anywhere else in Britain for that matter, although in some years birds have been known to summer at confidential coastal sites. Kentish plovers usually look strikingly whiter than other small plovers, especially on the sharply demarcated white forehead and eye stripe. They always have relatively big heads and long black legs. Adults are easily recognised by their narrow black shoulder lines, instead of complete black breast bands. Adult males have additional black and ginger markings on the crown. They are as small as little ringed plovers, but show an obvious wing bar in flight. Their typical call is a sharp, liquid blip, blip. But they also make a pishing bzibibib, bzibibib, rolling like a Dunlin song, but shorter. Kentish plovers are rare visitors to Britain, so keep your ears open for news of one, especially on the east or south coasts. Dotterel. Beautiful, rare, and often astonishingly tame, the dotterel is a birdwatcher's delight. Unusually, it's the females which do most of the displaying, and are therefore more colourful. Once the female has attracted a mate, she often leaves him to incubate and rear the chicks on his own. Meanwhile, she may continue to seek another willing male, or she may have a go at rearing another brood herself, perhaps on a different mountain, or even in a different country. In summer, even the duller males are beautifully marked with grey breasts and chestnut bellies, separated by a bold white line across the chest. This distinctive line is also visible in their duller, browner winter plumage, as are the bold white eye stripes meeting at the nape, which look even more striking in summer. They are not noisy birds, but a soft quit, quit sometimes gives them away. Perhaps 1,000 pairs breed in Britain, almost all on inaccessible whaleback mountains in the Highlands of Scotland. Elsewhere, they may occasionally turn up on passage, especially in spring when parties known as trips visit certain favoured localities every year. Golden plover. A visit to a moorland area in spring wouldn't be complete without hearing the piping notes of the golden plover or watching the male flapping stiffly overhead in his slow display flights. Small head, short bill, plump rounded body and run-stop peck feeding action identifies these birds as plovers. In all plumages they are smaller and browner than grey plovers. In summer their backs are beautifully spangled with golden markings and they have a variable amount of black on their head, throat and belly. In flight they look uniformly dull brown above, with just a trace of a pale wing bar. Their usual call is a simple, melancholy piping whistle. Displaying males produce a haunting disyllabic call in flight. And also a mellow yodeling. Toodly, 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 toodly. Golden plovers only breed at high altitudes, on areas of flat-topped moorland and grassland, mostly in Scotland and the Pennines. In winter, though, they congregate into flocks, which are most often seen on lowland farms, especially in coastal areas. Grey plover. The sound of a grey plover's call, echoing distantly across an estuary or salt marsh, is so evocative of winter days birdwatching by the coast. Grey plovers are bigger than golden plovers and have much greyer, almost silvery upper parts. Their stouter head, and especially the bigger, almost bulging eyes standing out in a paler face, are further helpful features. In spring, both plovers develop black underparts, but in the grey plover the black is more solid and much more extensive. Grey plovers look quite different in flight due to their obvious pale wing bars, pale barred upper tail, white rump and, diagnostically, obvious black underarm patches. Their evocative call is a long, slurred, three-note whistle. Grey plovers breed in the high Arctic, in Siberia and beyond. However, thousands come to Britain for the winter, and they are common birds of estuaries and mudflats all around our coasts. Lapwing. How welcome it is to see each spring the crazy, tumbling, diving antics of displaying lapwings, their calls telling you why they are sometimes called peewits, and their glossy sheen vindicating the alternative name of green plover. Lapwings are easily identified wading birds, medium-sized, black and white with white faces and a long upright crest. In flight, the floppy, rounded black and white wings make them unmistakable. Their calls are characteristic and familiar. Pee-wit, pee-wit-wit-wit. The lapwing is the most numerous wading bird breeding in Britain. It is common throughout the country, except in parts of the Scottish Highlands, Wales and southwest England, where they are sadly declining. They breed almost entirely in farmland areas, especially where there is a mixture of open ground for egg-laying and grassy fields for rearing their chicks. They move away from high ground in the autumn and make obvious southerly migrations during harsh winter weather. Knot. Except in its impressive red summer plumage, the knot is a rather nondescript bird, identified when you realise that it's not anything else. However, although one bird might be rather dull, the sight of thousands of knot, wheeling and turning in dense clouds, is one of the most awesome spectacles in birdwatching. In this sequence, the birds with red on the bellies are not showing traces of summer plumage. The smaller birds in the foreground are dunlin. The rest are winter plumage knot. Notice that they are bigger and dumpier than the dunlins. The bill of a knot is all dark and droops slightly like a dunlin, but is relatively shorter and much thicker. In flight, knot are uniformly grey, with a paler white wing bar and a paler mottled grey rump. They are usually silent, but you may hear a soft knut, knut, knut. You'd have to travel far into Siberia to hear their display calls. In winter, though, they occur often in thousands on most of our estuaries. They only rarely wander inland, not even to coastal lagoons, except at high tide. Sanderling. In winter, the sanderling is a familiar bird of British beaches, sprinting along the water's edge like little clockwork soldiers trying not to get their feet wet. Their almost white, silvery plumage distinguishes them from both the longer-billed dunlins and the smaller little stints. The contrasting black spot around the shoulder of the wing is another really useful feature. You have to become familiar with the size and shape of a sanderling to identify with confidence either the juveniles, with their spangled silver and black upper parts, or the summer plumage birds with their reddish upper parts heavily marked with black. In flight, the pale wing bar is broader and more contrasting than in similar birds such as dunlin or the stints. Sanderling don't always call, but you may hear a sharp, squeaky plick, plick. Sanderling only breed in the high Arctic, but they are common winter visitors to British coasts, occurring in impressive numbers on some estuaries. They are normally found on sandy beaches, especially where the waves meet the shore. Little stint. The little stint is much the commonest stint found in Britain. Their busy little bodies can be expected on almost any freshwater coastal wader pool, at least in the autumn. Most of the little stints seen in Britain are the beautifully marked juveniles, easily identified by the neat white lines or braces down the back. Adults in both summer and winter plumages resemble sanderlings, but stints are smaller, duller, and generally prefer freshwater habitats. These winter plumage birds like the braces, but notice how they are smaller and busier than the nearby dunlin, with clean white bellies and short, neat, straight black bills. They are best separated from Temminck stints by a combination of dumpy shape, well-marked plumage and black legs. The call of a little stint is a brief chip, but several such notes may be lumped together so quickly the sound could be mistaken for the trill of a Temminck stint. Little stints are regular passage migrants, especially during July to October, with numbers varying from year to year. A few birds winter, mostly in southern England, and the small numbers returning north in May could be in summer plumage. They can occur on the shoreline, but they prefer freshwater pools, and so are likely to turn up at inland sites too. Temminck stint. Looking through a swarming pack of little stints and dunlins, you may spot a bird which looks significantly duller and more lethargic. The size of a little stint, but with a plain, relatively unmarked back. You should immediately think of Temminck stint, but remember that little stints in winter plumage also have almost plain backs. If your bird is really a Temminck stint, the whole head and upper breast will be a dull grey-brown, which, together with the plain wings, suggests a tiny common sandpiper. In theory, the legs should be green or yellow, but you may have to look very hard to see a hint of non-black. Best of all, the bird should show a crouching stance and an exceptionally long-looking rear end. A combination of all these features will clinch the identification. In flight, both stints have white blocks in the sides of the tail, but only in the Temminck stint does this white extend down to the corners of the tail. Temminck stints give characteristic trilling flight calls as they tower away. During their display flights with quivering wings, the trill is extended and accelerated into an excited ringing sound. Only a lucky few will have heard this in Britain though, since it rarely breeds here, except at a secret site in Scotland. Even as a passage visitor, it is still a very scarce bird, but there are regular reports from some freshwater pools, especially near the coast. Purple sandpiper. The purple sandpiper isn't exactly purple, but for most of the year it does at least look distinctly bluey-grey. It is bigger and stockier than a dunlin, with a heavier but otherwise similar, slightly down-curved bill. In winter, their dark grey plumage can make them hard to detect against rocks and seaweed, but they become paler on the lower belly, and the yellow-orange feet and the yellow base to the bill provide welcome highlights. In summer plumage, they confusingly gain lots of rufous brown feathers and look like big, heavily streaked, yellow-legged dunlins, a description which also applies to the juveniles. In flight, again they resemble a big dark dunlin. They are not normally noisy, but you may hear a liquid quit. Purple sandpipers occur in small wintering flocks of usually a dozen or so birds at favoured sites around the coast. They almost invariably choose flat, rocky, seaweed-covered areas, although at high tide they may roost on man-made jetties. They hardly ever turn up inland, although up to 4 pairs have started to breed on remote Scottish mountains. The rest of the wintering population disappears to tundra areas beyond Scandinavia. Curlew sandpiper. The curlew sandpiper gets its name from the way the bill is down-curved like a curlew. However, if you rely on this as the only field character, you'll make lots of mistakes. In summer plumage, the curlew sandpiper is strikingly red, like a small, long-billed knot, and many of the birds seen in Britain in spring or autumn show traces of this. However, the majority of curlew sandpipers seen here are usually juveniles in autumn, like this one. Such birds are most similar to dunlin, but they are taller, longer-legged, longer-tailed and longer-billed. Plumage-wise, notice the long white eye stripe, the delicately scaly upper parts, and the peachy flush on the breast, all good field marks. In winter plumage, though, birds have to be identified more by their shape and more elegant jizz. In flight, identification is a cinch, because this is the only European dunlin lightwader with a broad white rump enclosed by a neat solid black tail. The call resembles that of dunlin, but the syllables are a little clearer, making a chirruping sound. Numbers of curlew sandpipers vary enormously from year to year, but plenty can often be seen during August and September, especially on the scrapes of East Coast reserves such as Cley, Minsmere and Blacktop Sands. They occur less frequently inland and on shorelines. They don't breed in Britain, but disappear to distant Siberian marshes in the summer. Dunlin. Even if you are already familiar with dunlins as winter and passage visitors to coasts and wetlands, it really is worth taking the trouble to also enjoy them on their breeding grounds. The male dunlin, resplendent in his brighter summer plumage, sits proudly on top of a tussock, bill open, making a mechanical whirring noise. The dunlin is our commonest small wader, but its fat shape and slightly down-curved bill are worth studying, so you'll find it easier to pick out something rarer. Most dunlin in spring and autumn show signs of either the black belly which is gained in summer or the black spots on the flanks which are typical of juvenile birds. Only in winter plumage do they have completely clean flanks and bellies, and then you have to rely on shapes and sizes to identify them. In flight, The dunlin is one of a dozen small waders which show a pale wing bar and white sides to the tail. They make huge flocks on some estuaries, but are equally at home on freshwater pools, including reservoirs far inland. Dunlin are extremely common in Britain in winter and on passage, especially in coastal areas. As breeding birds they love grassy moorlands, especially in Scotland and the Pennines. Ruff. In spring, ruffs throw spectacular parties, usually at dawn. All the males turn up at the chosen place in outrageous fancy dress costumes of red, black, orange and even white. Then they pose, posture and bow, jump up in the air in excited dances and sometimes even fight each other. Females arrive and watch carefully before deciding which one she will mate with. Sadly, these roughlegs can only be seen at a few places in Britain, such as the Ouse Washers, the Lower Derwent Valley and Martinmere. Elsewhere they occur mostly as passage visitors to freshwater pools. They are taller and leggier than dunlins, the males being about the size of a redshank, the females, known as reeves, being wood sandpiper sized. In all plumages they look rather fat-bodied but small-headed and short-billed, and their upper parts are usually well patterned with brown and buff. The juveniles show an immaculate scaly pattern above. Rough leg colours vary, so don't be surprised to find one with legs as red as a redshank. And look out too for birds showing signs of summer plumage, especially white-headed, white-chested males looking quite unlike anything in most bird books. In flight they look relatively long-winged, with a narrow pale wing bar, but striking white oval patches in the sides of the tail. They are usually silent, but you may hear gruff little croaking noises. Ruffs occur as numerous autumn migrants to freshwater pools near the coast, although sightings further inland are not unusual. Smaller numbers occur throughout the winter, sometimes on grassy fields, but hardly any stay to breed, except at the sites already mentioned. Jacksnipe. The jacksnipe is an extremely difficult bird to see, partly because they are not very common, but mostly because they are so well camouflaged they will often sit unnoticed and let you walk straight past them. Even if you flush one, you'll only get a brief view, as they characteristically dive down again without flying far. In that brief glimpse, you must judge their size and shape, smaller than a snipe, with a shorter bill, shorter tail and shorter wings, and also their plumage, with more striking golden stripes, but a minimal pale trailing edge to the wing. If you know where a jacksnipe is sitting, you should get exceptional views, good enough to see the short bill and tail, the longer, more contrasting golden back stripes, and the different head pattern, with an extra black stripe across the eyebrow, and with black stripes meeting at the ear coverts. Jacksnipe are nearly always silent, except on their North Arctic breeding grounds, and they give a deep toggy lock, toggy lock, toggy, giving them the name of the galloping horseman. Jacksnipe occur through most of Britain in winter, but they hide themselves away in areas of wet grassland and marshy pools and must be greatly overlooked. Snipe. The springtime display of the snipe is something special. He usually starts by flying methodically over the breeding site, calling loudly, but then he suddenly dives down with his outer tail feathers at right angles, so that the rushing air makes them hum. A snipe can easily be identified. either by its extraordinarily long bill or by its familiar camouflage plumage, with stripes through its head and down its back. When flushed, a snipe rises noisily and vertically, zigzagging to a height before dropping some distance away. The long bill, pointed wings and stripy plumage are usually visible, and the white trailing edge to the wing should stand out. Their alarm call is a loud, rasping sh. Displaying birds usually call first, chipper, 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 before diving down to reverberate their tail feathers. The snipe is a common visitor to marshy and muddy wetlands throughout Britain. About 2,000 pairs are thought to breed on wet pastures in lowland Britain, but the population on the moorland bogs of Scotland, Wales and the Pennines could be 10 times that figure. Woodcock. Woodcocks live in dense, damp woodland and are so well camouflaged that they would be rarely seen if it wasn't for their roving display flights, when males fly back and forth over woodlands on spring evenings. The purpose of these flights has long been a mystery, but apparently the males are effectively curb crawling, cruising up and down, looking for a female to have sex with. As soon as one appears, they dive onto her, mate quickly, and then continue cruising again. The roding woodcock is fat-bodied and rather round-winged, and can look rather owl-like, but of course owls don't have long pointed bills. At rest, a woodcock is easily told from a snipe because the head stripes go across the top of the crown rather than along it. A roding woodcock makes two noises, a loud, clear twisick, twisick, and a softer, deeper croaking. Wop, wop, wop. Wop, wop, wop. Woodcocks occur in wooded areas throughout Britain. The population is boosted by an influx of migrants which stay for the winter. However, woodcocks are unlikely to be found, amongst other waders, in freshwater pools. Black-tailed godwit. The black-tailed godwit is one of our most spectacular waders, especially in summer when it has a red head and breast, as well as the obvious black and white wing and tail pattern. At rest, when the wing and tail markings are hidden, both godwits resemble curlews, but have straighter beaks and, in summer, reddish plumage. These summer plumage godwits can be identified as blacktails by the white flanks and undertails. This juvenile has already acquired the plain grey back of its first winter plumage, which separates it from the more heavily marked bar-tailed godwit. Younger juvenile blacktails have orangier breasts. If plumage details aren't clear, the length of leg visible above the knee joint, which is really the ankle, is always longer on a black-tailed, long enough to write the word black rather than just the word bar. In flight, blacktails have long trailing legs and long neck and bill, as well as the striking black and white patterns on the wing and tail. Their call is rather hoarse, becoming an excited whittering when the birds are on breeding grounds. Black-tailed godwits are numerous winter and passage visitors to Britain, but they tend to concentrate at favoured estuaries, especially in northwest and southern England. About 30 to 40 pairs also breed in Britain, more than half of which are usually on the Ouse washers, where the wet lowland meadows are ideal. Bar-tailed godwit. Bar-tailed godwits don't breed in Britain, since their favoured nesting habitat is Arctic tundra. In summer, they go completely brick red underneath from bill to tail. These birds aren't quite in full summer plumage, but the signs of red around the vent are enough to rule out blacktails. The shorter upper leg is also obvious here. The other birds here can be identified by their streaky, rather curlew-like upper parts, and at this range you can also see some barring on the upper tail. The relatively more upturned bill of a bar-tailed godwit can be very difficult to judge. Bar-tailed godwits in flight resemble small curlews with generally brown upper parts, except for the triangular white rump and pale barred upper tail. However, they have slightly upturned rather than obviously downturned bills. Their calls are similar to black-tailed godwit in rhythm, but they are softer, becoming a chattering give-ick, 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 give-ick when excited. Bar-tailed godwits are widespread and numerous, winter and passage visitors to muddy and sandy shorelines, with thousands occurring in some estuaries. Whimbrel. The whimbrel is a smaller and rarer relative of the curlew, often located on estuaries by its stammering call. Whimbrels look very much like curlews and have similarly down-curved bills, but they are smaller, with shorter bills and obvious stripes through the crown. In flight, their smaller size and quicker wing beats are the best ways of separating them. The call is a distinctive whistle of about 10 notes, repeated very quickly in a stammering fashion. Singing birds start off like a curlew, but then accelerate into a prolonged trill, even faster than the call. Whimbrels are widespread but seldom numerous, winter and passage visitors to estuaries around Britain. A small but increasing population breeds on moorland in the far north of Scotland, especially on the Shetlands. Curlew. Curlews are common enough birds, at least in northern Britain, so their display flights and magnificent bubbling songs can be enjoyed every spring. They are easily identified, big and streaky brown with a long, obviously down-curved bill, even longer on the females. In flight, they are mottled brown with white rumps and barred upper tails. They are bigger than whimbrels and lack the stripes in the crown. Even in winter, their ringing calls are evocative. Curlee, curlee. In spring, though, they fly up, rather clumsily, giving loud but hesitant calls, which accelerate into a brief trill before the bird glides slowly down, making those rich, bubbling cries. Curlews breed widely in Britain, especially north and west of the line between Flamborough Head and the Severn Estuary. This reflects their preference for areas of upland, grassland and moorland, although scattered populations also exist in lowland England. In winter, they occur in numbers in most coastal areas, but are relatively scarce inland. Spotted redshank. Sadly, we don't often get to see this redshank in its spotted plumage, which is entirely sooty black with white spots throughout the summer. Such birds disappear to Arctic forests and pools, but sometimes delight us on their way there or back. Spotted redshanks are more familiar to us in winter plumage, looking slimmer, paler and greyer than common redshanks, with longer legs and longer, finer beaks. The obvious white stripe from bill to eye is another good feature. In flight, spotted redshanks lack the white wing bars of a common redshank, and their tails are more heavily barred. This makes their white rump look more like an oval patch on the lower back. Their long trailing legs are also distinctive. The call is a loud, clear and memorable chewit, chewit, chewit. Spotted redshanks are widespread passage visitors to British coasts, favouring estuaries and freshwater pools. Small numbers winter at southern coastal sites. Redshank. It's no good trying to creep up quietly to get good views of any group of birds which includes a redshank. Sure enough, the redshank will spot you first and fly around screaming, causing all the other birds to panic. Redshanks are medium-sized waders, with longer bills than, say, rough or not, and with relatively dull brown plumage but bright red legs. In flight, they are the only British wader with a broad white bar across the trailing edge of the wing. The extensive white rump and upper tail is also most striking. Their call is more melancholy than a greenshank's call, and is always slurred downwards towards the end. Redshanks are widespread and abundant in most coastal areas, especially on estuaries and salt marshes. They also like freshwater pools, and often occur far inland, at reservoirs, gravel pits, and even wet meadows. Over 30,000 pairs of redshanks are thought to breed in Britain, mostly on salt marshes or wet grassland, including boggy moorland. Greenshank. The elegant greenshank is an exciting find on its breeding grounds, its spectacular ringing calls echoing across the flow country of northern Scotland. Greenshanks are taller, slimmer and greyer than redshanks, with dull greenish legs and a longer, slightly upturned bill. They invariably look paler, especially on the head and neck. In flight, they have all dark wings, contrasting with the white upper tail, which extends in a long V up the back. Their flight call is a consistent ringing whistle, never down-slurred, and usually repeated 2 or 3 times. Choo-choo, choo-choo-choo. The haunting song is a rhythmic cloorie, 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 cloorie. Although over 1,000 pairs of greenshanks breed on the peaty flows in the far north of Scotland, most birdwatchers know them as regular passage visitors to coastal areas, including saltwater estuaries and freshwater pools. Small numbers pass through inland areas, visiting reservoirs and gravel pits. Some greenshanks stay in winter around the coasts of southern England. Green sandpiper. The green sandpiper usually nests in trees, often laying its eggs in the old nests of thrushes, though sadly not in this country, where it is a passage migrant and winter visitor. It's closely related to the wood and common sandpipers, but is the biggest and bulkiest in this group. Green sandpipers almost invariably look contrastingly dark above and light below, indeed almost black and white, with the dark head and breast coming to an abrupt end level with the bottom edge of the wings, thus isolating the white belly. The wings and mantle show only faint pale spots, and there is a striking white line from the bill round the eye and back again. Green sandpipers move rather slowly and frequently bob like common sandpipers. In flight they again look black and white, the white rump contrasting with the dark back and dark underwings, almost like a big house martin. Their call is distinctive, a liquid titluit, titluit, luit. The ringing titty-roo, titty-roo, titty-roo display call is unlikely to be heard in Britain. Green sandpipers are regular passage migrants, especially in autumn, to freshwater pools, ditches and dikes, inland as well as by the coast. A sandpiper seen inland in winter is most likely to be this species. Wood sandpiper. The wood sandpiper in all plumages is slimmer, leggier and more elegant than the other sandpipers, more like a small redshank. They also have beautifully spangled upper parts and an obvious pale eye stripe. They are a paler brown than the green sandpiper, and there is no obvious contrast between dark breast and pale belly. In flight, wood sandpipers show a neat, square white rump, but they look brown and white, not black and white, and their underwings are pale. Their call on rising is a characteristic chiffifif, chiffifif. In summer, they perform wonderful song flights, uttering the plaintive cloovy, 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 cloovy. Sadly, only a lucky few birdwatchers get to hear wood sandpipers displaying in Britain, since it is an exceptionally rare breeder in northern Scotland. On passage, though, they are widespread and sometimes numerous, usually at freshwater scrapes and marshes. Common sandpiper. The common sandpiper always behaves distinctively, whether at rest with its tail bobbing perpetually, or in flight when it flicks over the water with stiff bowed wings. Its plumage is dull, uniform brown above, plainer than the other sandpipers, although juveniles can appear faintly barred. Diagnostically, the smudgy brown pattern on the breast doesn't extend as far down as the wings, so there is always a loop of white in front of the bend of the wing. It does have a bit of an eye ring and a bit of an eye stripe, but neither are as conspicuous as in the other species. In flight, they show a pale wing bar and brown and white barring in the edge of the tail. Their typical call is swee-wee-wee, swee-wee-wee, or a simple soo, soo, soo. They have a wonderful piping song to the rhythm of "Is Susan in, is Susan in, is Susan in, is Susan in." Common sandpipers are summer visitors to most of northern Britain, where they nest commonly by rivers, lakes and reservoirs. Many occur on passage elsewhere in England, especially in freshwater pools. Turnstone. Apart from bird artists, and possibly some bird ringers, how many birdwatchers could accurately describe where all the white bits are on a flying turnstone? The truth is that as this bird flies off, there seem to be white bits everywhere, and it is this harlequin pattern which makes it unmistakable. Their habit of walking busily along, deftly flicking over pebbles, have given them their regular name and also the nickname of brick flicker. In winter plumage, turnstones are mostly dark brown on the head and upper parts, and there is a distinctive curving black blob extending down either side of the breast. This contrasts clearly with the pure white belly. In summer plumage, the head becomes splendidly black and white, and rich brown and black colours appear in the mantle. Their call is a hollow, rolling tuk-tuk, tuk-tuk. Turnstones are common winter visitors to rocky shores all around Britain. A few birds stay into the summer, but rarely show any signs of breeding here. Inland sightings are unusual. Red-necked phalarope. The red-necked phalarope is one of our rarest breeding waders, and also a scarce passage visitor, so we get few opportunities to enjoy its frenzied spinning across the surface of a pool. Its normally confiding nature makes this a particularly special bird to encounter. Phalaropes are the only waders which habitually swim on water, feeding by stirring as they move, then reaching to pick insects from the surface. Compared to its relative, the grey phalarope, this species is smaller and slimmer, with a longer, finer, more needle-like bill, and, in all plumages, a bolder pattern on its back. This juvenile bird has two obvious pale lines down either side of its back, which distinguish it from the grey phalarope. In summer plumage, both species show conspicuous red in their underparts, but in the red-necked phalarope this is limited to a band around most of the neck. Incidentally, this is bolder and brighter in the female, which does most of the displaying and often leaves the male to rear the young on his own. Red-necked phalarope calls include a conversational twittering and a rather coot-like cute, cute. There are thought to be less than 20 pairs of red-necked phalaropes left in Britain, almost all of which are now on the Shetlands. However, small numbers of mainly juvenile birds do turn up near the east coast every year, especially in August. Grey phalarope. The grey phalarope has similar feeding and breeding habits to the red-necked and can often be blissfully confiding. Birds seen in Britain are usually in winter plumage, with pale grey backs, or, if they are juveniles like this one, they have a mixture of brown and grey back feathers. In all cases, their bill will be shorter than those of red-necked phalaropes. The calls of grey phalaropes are similar to red-necked, though perhaps a little softer. In summer, the nearest breeding areas for grey phalaropes are in Iceland, and they would normally spend the winter floating on the open waters of the South Atlantic. However, strong westerly winds, especially in September and October, often bring them to our shores and even to inland sites.